Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du fa'uzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. One of the very first patients I ever took care of as a medical student was a young man who came to the hospital because he was having trouble breathing. After some investigation, we realized that the root cause of his distress were drugs. This young 28-year-old man was an avid methamphetamine addict, and the drug itself had wreaked havoc on his heart. In a few years, I would find myself declaring this patient's time of death, all because he had succumbed to his addiction. Now, I wish this was a unique case, but that's not so. Addiction is way more common than many of us like to think. In 2022, in the United States, 61 million people tried drugs for the first time, and 46 million people became addicted to one substance or another. To put that into perspective, 1 in 3 Americans in the United States will develop a drug addiction at some point in their lifetime. 1 in 3. This shows addiction is not a disease that affects just a few people. This is a widespread public health epidemic, and one that even we in our community are not immune to. In 2023, the CDC estimates that over 107,000 deaths occurred because of drug overdoses. Yes, this is a statistic, but at the same time, this is a heart-wrenching reality of lives cut short, families torn apart, and communities in crisis. But drug overdoses alone are just one part of the picture of addiction. Beyond overdoses, substances continue to take people's lives, but at a slower yet an alarming rate. Smoking is the #1 cause of preventable deaths in the United States, followed by alcohol being the #3 cause of preventable deaths in the United States. And aside from substances, there are other addictions that are just as dangerous. Gambling, social media, pornography are being recognized increasingly as behavioral addictions. Gambling, for instance, is fueled by unpredictable rewards that stimulate the brain, leading to compulsive behavior that can lead to a destruction of people's families as well as their work and livelihood. What's even more concerning is that nowadays, you do not have to go to a casino to gamble. You can gamble comfortably from your couch, from the comfort of your own home. Sit down, turn on the TV, put on the game, take out your phone, and place a bet. These are not new issues that we are dealing with. In fact, they date back to our ancestors. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has discussed these exact vices in the Holy Quran, in the verses that were mentioned just previously in the opening ceremony. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "O ye who believe, wine and the game of hazard and idols and divining arrows are only an abomination of Satan's handiwork. So shun each one of them, that you may prosper. Satan desires to create enmity and hatred among you by the means of wine and the game of hazard, and to keep you back from the remembrance of Allah and from prayer. But will you remain back?" It's important to understand that one does not simply fall into the grasp of addiction instantly. Often it starts off as small things that give us pleasure and over time grow into the storm of addiction. They may be small sins that then become bigger sins. The Holy Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has warned us against small sins, describing them as a kindling that ignites a destructive fire. He says, "Beware of sins that are treated as insignificant, for they will gather together until they destroy a person." At its core, addiction is a chronic medical condition where substances or behaviors hijack the brain's reward mechanism. And over time, the brain, which is resilient, adapts to these overriding factors, leading to tolerance, then dependence, until we are reduced to a place where we do not even find natural pleasure in things. This cycle continues and continues until it traps the individuals where they become slaves to the substance or the behavior itself. Now, addiction affects two main parts of the brain. It affects the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. And I know this may get a little complicated, but I'm going to make it very simple. The limbic system is located in the middle of your brain, and it releases a chemical called dopamine, which tells you this feels good. Let's do more. I like this. The prefrontal cortex is located in the front of the brain, and it acts as the brain's boss, telling you that's enough. It's okay, we've done enough. And together, they work in harmony in keeping our cravings and our desires under control. In addiction, however, this balance, this harmony is disrupted significantly. Substances like alcohol, marijuana, opiates, even nicotine affect this system in two main ways. These substances, number one, affect the limbic system by flooding our bodies with an immense amount of dopamine, much more than our normal amount, which tells us that this substance feels good. Like I said, let's do more. And at the same time, these substances quiet the prefrontal cortex, giving us unopposed dopamine release. Over time, the brain does get rewired, requiring more and more dopamine until the person becomes reliant on that substance or that activity to even function at a normal standard, let alone live in a stage of euphoria. Addiction does not simply affect the brain alone. It also affects our soul. And to understand how addiction affects the soul, one must understand the soul itself. Now, thankfully, the promised Messiah ﷺ has given us an amazing guide into the three stages of the soul, or nafs. The first stage of the soul is called nafs-e amara. This is the lowest stage of the soul, where a person is dominated by his or her most basic desires and inclinations towards sin. To overcome nafs-e amara, one must recognize their weakness, seek Allah's forgiveness, and actively work to restrain themselves from the activities that stray us away from the righteous path. The second stage of nafs is called nafs-e-lawama. This is the intermediate stage, where a person begins to develop a conscience and feels remorse for their wrongdoings. At this level, the individual experiences sins and struggles to reform, and understands that they may still falter and go back into the ways of error. This stage represents an internal battle between good and evil inclinations. Suppressing the first stage of nafs-e amara, and progressing to the second stage, nafs-e-lawama, requires sincerity, repentance, and striving to replace bad habits with good ones. The final stage of nafs is called nafs-e-lawama. This is the highest stage of the soul, achieved by those who completely submit to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At this stage, the believer's heart is in harmony with the divine will, and they have conquered their lowest desires. Achieving this final stage, nafs-e mutmainna, requires persistent effort, sincere prayer, and reliance on Allah for guidance and strength. In preparation for this speech, I realized that our beautiful religion aligns perfectly with the concepts of even modern-day science, like the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. From my perspective, and from the research I have done, there are real-world applications of these old topics that were presented to us decades and years ago. You see, nafs-e amara, the first stage of nafs, the first part of our soul, may represent the limbic system. It is responsible for the pleasure and reward-seeking aspects of our brain, which are some of our most basic and animalistic desires. Nafs-e-lawama might represent the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for our decision-making and higher thinking, impulse control, also representing a higher and more advanced thought process that we develop. And the balance between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex may represent nafs-e mutma'inna, where our animalistic desires and higher thinking are balanced in a way where we can focus everything on Allah. Nowadays, we're dealing with other forms of addiction that many of us tend to think less of or don't even consider at times. For example, social media addiction. Social media addiction is driven by algorithms designed to maximize engagement, foster compulsive use, that leads to impaired mental health. Studies have shown that if you are consuming more than 3 hours of social media in a day, the chances of you developing anxiety and depression skyrocket, especially in the young and adolescents. Hazrat Khalifatul Masih al-Khamis has spoken extensively about these types of addictions, saying that there is a pervasive harm caused by excessive engagement with TV, with the internet, especially as it pertains to our fundamental spiritual obligations. Hazur has said that many a times people will not participate in salat, especially as it pertains to waking up for Fajr prayer, because of these activities. These habits not only affect and disrupt a person's relationship with Allah, they can also spill over by weakening their sense of responsibility towards family and their moral values. Another such digital addiction that many of us tend to not discuss, and especially in our community, is pornography. Just like drugs or alcohol, pornography similarly triggers the brain's reward pathway, desensitizing users to natural stimuli and damaging relationships by fostering unrealistic expectation and even leading to intimacy avoidance. These behaviors can evolve into compulsions and harm families and communities. In one Friday sermon, Hazur discusses how some people are drawn towards sin, especially worldly activities, to the extent that they end up perishing spiritually. Hazur discusses how adult content is freely available in such a way that man has turned himself into an animal. At times, he receives complaints that young or middle-aged Ahmadis are also involved in such behaviors, and these activities lead to the destruction of the family unit, and eventually divorce ensues. In these instances, it is imperative that we remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's first commandment regarding parda. قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغْزُوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُمْ. Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and guard their chastity. ذَلِكَ أَزْكَى لَهُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ. That is pure for them. Indeed, Allah is well aware of what they do. The very first commandment regarding parda is not addressed to women. It's addressed to men. Say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze. As men, it is our job to lower our gaze, especially in instances where Satan tests us. Allah knows that men are more prone to this than women are. And this too has been studied in medical literature, in research. Studies have shown that men consume more pornography than women, a fact that is surprising to absolutely no one. But in our very nature, we know that we are weaker than our counterparts. Hence why we have been commanded first to avoid these sins, to look away when tempted. And we should heed this commandment. Otherwise, we will never leave that first stage of nafs-e amara, where we are controlled by our inclinations towards sin. Now, one crucial factor in addiction is the age of onset. Research has shown that the earlier a person starts experimenting with drugs or behaviors, the higher the likelihood of them developing an addiction. For example, if a child has his first drink of alcohol at age 14 or earlier, the risk of them developing an alcohol use disorder or becoming what we call an alcoholic skyrockets to almost 50% or even more in some instances. Why is that the case? The answer is actually very simple. The brain does not stop developing until the age of 25, with the prefrontal cortex being one of the very last parts of our brain to finish developing. If substances are introduced during this crucial time of brain development, they impair the function of the prefrontal cortex. They impair the ability for it to properly mature. The brain that has not developed cannot regulate its impulses, and therefore making it more vulnerable to becoming addicted to any substance or behavior. Our second Khalifa, Hazrat Mirza Bashiruddin Mahmud Ahmad has spoken about this extensively, saying that there are three phases of human life and how they align with all physical, mental, and spiritual maturity. At age 18, we approach physical maturity, with our bodies being fully developed. At age 25, we approach mental maturity, where we reach full cognitive development, including decision-making, emotion regulation, and also long-term planning, all of which align perfectly with modern-day science. And finally, around age of 40, a person enters into the phase of spiritual maturity, becoming more reflective and attuned to higher processes and purposes in life. Many prophets, including the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, received revelations around this age, symbolizing the culmination of their spiritual journeys. Yet again, we see how amazingly Islam aligns with even modern-day science. You see, believe it or not, the concept that the brain does not develop fully until the age of 18 is a relatively new concept in medicine. It was not accepted until the early 2000s as a fact. Before that, there was a long-standing belief that the brain develops fully at the age of 18 alongside physical maturity. Hazrat Muslim Maud explicitly talked about this exact fact in the 1900s, well over 50 years before our most contemporary scientists had this groundbreaking study and this groundbreaking revelation. For my young brothers and sisters now who might be listening to my speech, I know from firsthand that there's going to be a thought that pops into your mind, a thought that says, one time won't hurt. I urge you to not listen to that thought. I once took care of a young 18-year-old patient who came to the hospital because they had decided to try ecstasy for the first time in their life. They were at a party, they wanted to have some fun, and they tried some ecstasy, and what happened next is beyond tragic. This patient developed a seizure, and a seizure that was so severe that by the time they came to us in the hospital, this patient was already brain dead. The parents were at the bedside, and they were beside themselves with grief. The mother was crying inconsolably, and the father simply blamed himself. Ultimately, the child passed away, and later, I would come to learn that this was a straight-A student who was going to a prestigious university and had plans of becoming a lawyer, plans that were cut too soon. The fact is that these vices, drugs, alcohol, even gambling, have real life-altering and at times life-ending consequences and should be avoided rather than tested. Even one time is one too many. There are numerous reports of patients developing schizophrenia after using marijuana just once. And by the way, marijuana is widely known and perceived to be a benign drug. Let me give you another fact. Did you know that even a one-time use of methamphetamine is enough to lead to addiction to methamphetamine? I know it sounds crazy, but this is true because methamphetamine releases so much dopamine in the brain that after the first time, a user will continuously chase that high but never achieve it. And that's how they become stuck in the shackle of addiction. Or what about vaping? What about nicotine? What about smoking? Nicotine goes into the bloodstream and affects the brain so quickly that most people don't even realize that by the time you take a breath in, it's already affecting your brain. Many people tend to believe that vaping, for example, is safer than cigarettes because it doesn't lead to cancer, which might be true. However, there are numerous case reports out there indicating that the vaping aspect also damages lungs into a point where they cannot be repaired. So is vaping actually safer? The truth is, you don't need to be a doctor to answer that question. To my parents in the audience, it is our duty to ensure that we look after and safeguard our children from the evils that lurk in society. We must be mindful and vigilant and not assume that our children can do no wrong. Some parents believe that their kids are completely and utterly amazing and are angels, which they might be. However, they are still able to sin. They give their kids unrestricted access to cell phones and the internet and assume that the children will be safe. For the fathers who are listening right now, remember that we will be held accountable for the care and upbringing of our families. The Holy Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that a man is a shepherd for his family and is responsible for his flock. And as for the mothers, it is also your responsibility to ensure that our children are being disciplined properly. Yesterday, we heard a story about a man who was sentenced to death. And on his death sentencing, he asked to see his mother. When his mother came, he asked her to stick out her tongue, and he bit it off. When asked why, he said, had his mother used her tongue to discipline him when he was young, he would not be in this state right now. As parents, we cannot sit idly by and assume our children are going to be safe from Satan's grasp on their own. We must do everything we can do to teach them to stay on the right path. Just as we would prevent our child from touching the fire for fear of getting burned, we must make sure that we teach our kids to avoid the vices that are out there, that are ever so easily available, especially as they get older. So how do we avoid falling into the quicksand of addiction, knowing full well that the downward spiral is rapid? The answer is very simple, and I'm sure many of you know what I'm going to say. Islam. Our beautiful religion provides an abundance of information, guidance, and support for combating not only societal ills, but also fighting the transition between small sins into full-blown shackles of addiction. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu kutiba alaykumus siyamu kama kutiba alallazina min qablakum la'allakum tattaqun. O ye who believe, fasting is prescribed to you as it was prescribed for those before you, that you may become righteous. Fasting has immense benefits on the body. This has been well researched and documented. However, we also forget that fasting has immense benefits on our mind and our soul. Fasting offers a profound opportunity to redirect our desires from worldly pursuits to spiritual growth, refocusing our minds from dependency on substances to reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and taking a significant step forward to salvation by strengthening our connection with Him. During the process of fasting, you as a person are forced to be more in tune to your cravings and your desires. You may be sitting at the office and you might see a donut and you might want it, but you know that because you are fasting, you do not have to eat that donut. And I do speak from personal experience on that one. By doing so, you are actively avoiding those surges of dopamine that bring you down the path of addiction, even when it comes to substances like food. In fact, Hazrat Muslim radhiyallahu anhu once said that he occasionally would stop drinking chai during breakfast to avoid making it into a habit and to become dependent on it. Now, I'm not saying this so that many of you stop drinking chai, because I know that's going to be very hard. I'm simply saying this to show you that even something as beloved as our chai can become a tool for Satan to use to control us. And if we look to the past, we see multiple examples of how we can follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His commandments. One such example was also presented yesterday about how alcohol was banned in Islam. And before, in the early days of Medina, Alcohol was a normal part of life, but when the commandment came, the Sahaba listened. They did not fight. They broke their chalices. They broke their containers, and the streets of Medina flowed freely with wine. This shows the devotion that the Sahaba had for the word of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and for the commandments of Allah Almighty. One should strive to emulate these examples as they show how strong our faith has to be to fully avoid these ills. But by far, the most powerful tool that we have to combat the risk of addiction is salat. Salat establishes a direct connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, offering hope and forgiveness. Its disciplined structure, performed 5 times daily, helps replace harmful habits with consistent worship and mindfulness, countering the cravings and impulses that we may have. It reminds believers to avoid sin while fostering resilience. And in congregational prayer, it plays a huge role in combating isolation, a theme that is very common in the world of addiction. Ultimately, salat is a reminder of Allah's mercy and a means to seek redemption, as it is a spiritual anchor of hope. To achieve nafs-e mutmainna, the highest stage of the soul, we must submit in supplication. The promised Messiah ﷺ has said that the salat itself is meant to be a plea made with burning, yearning, and anguish that Allah Almighty may remove ill intentions and evil passions from within, and in their place, engender a pristine love through His universal grace. And in yesterday's speech, we saw and we heard how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most merciful, Ar-Rahim, and the great forgiver, Al-Ghafur. Therefore, it is imperative that we turn to Him in salat to not only ask for forgiveness for our sins, but to also safeguard us from the evils that surround us daily. Now, despite all of this, the truth is, some of us may fall into these habits, and for some of us, these habits will become the shackles of addiction that we have discussed. Many of us may know someone in our community who could be addicted, and when this comes to light, we tend to ostracize them, pushing them further into isolation. Some in our community, and definitely in society at large, tend to look down upon these individuals rather than try to understand the suffering that they are going through. Instead, we should be reaching out to them and offering them a helping hand. Even the promised Messiah ﷺ has talked about caring for those who are less fortunate than us. In Malfuzat, he says that if he had a friend who was a drunk and fell unconscious, he would not abandon him. Instead, he would pick him up, take him home, and pray for his reformation. This shows his love for humanity and his desire to support those, especially those who are at their lowest point in their lives, rather than look down upon them. Now, if there's one thing I have learned as an addiction specialist, is that nobody wants to grow up being addicted. Nobody wants to become a slave to a substance or a behavior. Nobody says, I want to be an addict. Circumstances, experiences, and even events way beyond their control lead them down into the path of addiction and play a huge role in this problem. Therefore, it's important for us to approach these cases with humanity and empathy rather than anger and disgust. It's important for us to approach it with love rather than hatred, especially when we as a community stand by love for all and hatred for none. Now, the truth is, no one here is safe from physical, virtual, or even behavioral addictions. We are constantly being bombarded by Satan's tools that keep us further from God. These acts are shrouded as the guise of pleasure, the rush of dopamine, but in fact take us one step closer to becoming the slaves of addiction controlled by sin and debauchery. Of course, there are some medications out there that can help you, but the best treatment is preventative. And the truth is, there is no better form of prevention than turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah guide us all and make us righteous individuals. Ameen. May Allah help those amongst us who are suffering from any type of addiction and are stuck in the shackles of addiction. Ameen. And may Allah safeguard our children so that they do not fall into the quicksand of addiction. Ameen. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Jazakallah.